Montana Territory, July 1883. The river took her quicker than grief ever had. 1 second, Priscilla Rowan stood ankle-deep in the Bitterroot's cold, rushing current, skirts hiked, eyes blank as the sky. The next, the river grabbed her legs out from under her and she was gone. The current spun her like a leaf. Her hat slipped off. Her boots filled. She went under once, twice, then a strong arm caught her. His shoulder slammed into her ribs as he dragged her to shore. They hit the bank hard. Water poured off her clothes and hair as she coughed, gasping. She blinked up at a wide chest, a soaked blue shirt, and a face shadowed by the sun. "You trying to drown yourself?" His voice was low, rough. She turned away, coughing again. Her lungs burned. "I slipped." "Sure you did," he muttered, crouching beside her. He had a sharp jaw under a short beard and a line between his brows like he had not smiled in years. "You got a name?" "Priscilla." She sat up slow. "Rowan." He looked her over. "You live near here?" "No," her voice cracked. "I was passing through. I do not have anywhere to go." He stood, offered his hand. "You do now." She stared at it. "Why would you help me?" "Because you need it," he said simply. "Come on. I am not leaving you here soaked and freezing." She took his hand. His name was Heath Abram. He lived half a day's ride from the river, in the hills west of Stevensville, on a stretch of land that looked like it had been carved straight out of the earth's ribs: hard soil, stubborn grass, wild flowers that bloomed without permission. He walked beside her, leading his horse, coat around her shoulders, saying very little. They reached his homestead by dusk. A one-room cabin, a small barn, a rough fence curling around a patch of corn and beans. A chicken darted across the path and Heath grunted like it had betrayed him. Priscilla managed a small laugh. He lit a fire, gave her dry clothes too big but warm, and poured hot coffee she could barely hold. He watched her from across the table, arms crossed. His sleeves were rolled, showing forearms caked with sun and work. "You alone?" he asked. She nodded. "My husband died last winter. Fever took him slow. We had a little place in Idaho. I buried him under our apple tree." He glanced at her hands, red from the cold. "You walk here." "Mostly." He did not ask why. She was glad for that. She did not want to tell him about the silence in their cabin once her husband died. About the neighbors who stopped calling her by name and started saying, "Poor thing." About the way the nights stretched like punishment. She just needed to be somewhere else. "I can stay in the barn," she said. "No," he stood, heading for the woodpile. "You are sleeping in here. I will take the floor." She did not argue. That night, she lay on his bed with the quilt pulled to her chin, listening to the wind outside and the soft creak of the floorboards as Heath moved around. He did not sleep. She could tell. He just stared at the ceiling like it might give him answers. In the morning, he handed her a mug and said, "You can stay as long as you need." She nodded. "Thank you." He frowned. "I mean it." Days passed. She found her hands wanting something to do, so she mended his shirts, swept the cabin, fed the chickens. Heath never asked her to. He just watched, quiet and unreadable, until one afternoon he said, "You do not have to earn it, you know." "I like helping," she said. "Makes me feel part of something again." He looked away, jaw tight. "I know what you mean." He never said what had happened to him, but she saw it in the way he flinched when he heard sudden noises, or how he stood too still sometimes, like the world might notice he was in it. He never mentioned family, never said where he came from, but he worked hard, sunup to sundown, and never once looked at her like she was a burden. One evening, after supper, she brushed her hands on her skirt and said, "Why are you alone out here?" He wiped the table. "Because people are cruel. Land is not." She tilted her head. "You do not seem like someone who ran from something." "I did not run," he said. "I lost." He walked out after that. She stood in the doorway and watched him lean on the fence, staring at nothing. The sky turned red, then dark. She wanted to go to him, but it felt too soon. Weeks passed, and summer deepened. Priscilla rose early, helped with the garden, learned how to milk the goat, even patched the roof with Heath one hot afternoon. He handed her nails, and their fingers brushed, and something quiet passed between them. He looked at her like he wanted to say something, but did not. That night, she stood outside brushing her hair when he came up beside her. "You look better," he said. "Stronger." "I feel it," she said. "Like I am still here. Like I matter again." "You always mattered." She looked up at him. "Even when I was just some widow in a river?" He met her eyes. "Especially then." He kissed her then, soft like he was afraid she would break. But she did not. She leaned into it, hands on his chest, and he held her like she was the first warmth he had felt in years. After that, everything changed without changing. They moved through the days like always, but now their hands lingered. Their eyes met longer. He touched the small of her back as she passed. She fixed his collar in the mornings. They laughed more, sat closer. One morning, she found him fixing the fence, hammer in hand, shirt off, sweat down his spine. She stood watching too long. He looked up. "You staring for a reason?" "I like the view," she said, cheeks flushed. He dropped the hammer and came to her. "You sure you want this?" She nodded. "I am sure. I pulled you out of that river," he said quietly. "But I do not want you to stay just because I saved you." She stepped close, touched his face. "You did not just save me from the water, Heath. You saved me from everything else too." His mouth found hers again. This time it was not soft. That night, under the stars, he took both her hands and said, "I want you here. Not as a guest. Not as someone passing through. I want you as my wife." She blinked, breath-catching. "You mean that?" "I have never meant anything more." She smiled, eyes wet, heart full for the first time in a long, long time. "Then call me that. Right now." He kissed her forehead and whispered, "Wife." And just like that, she was home. The first snow came early that year, a thin hush over the hills by mid-September. Heath stood at the edge of the pasture, one gloved hand resting on the gate, watching the sky soften to gray. Behind him, Priscilla hung damp linens near the stove, her breath curling in the cold air like smoke. "You reckon it'll stick?" she asked, adjusting the clothespin with stiff fingers. He turned, nodding once. "Ground's cold enough. We'll need to bring the squash in before nightfall." She crossed to the window, arms folded for warmth. "I'll start with the ones near the fence." "No," he pulled off his gloves as he stepped inside. "I'll take care of it. You've been coughing again." She pressed a hand to her chest. "It's nothing. You said that last week." It was true last week. He set a pot on the stove with more force than needed, the clang echoing. "Let me carry the weight, Pris. I'm not made of glass." "Neither am I," she said softly, not looking at him. He watched her a long moment, the back of her neck pale where she'd pinned her hair up. Then he crossed the room and placed a hand on her shoulder. She leaned back slightly into his touch, and the silence between them eased. They spent the afternoon in quiet tasks. He brought in the squash, she mended the flour sack that would become pillow-ticking come winter. No words passed, but none were needed. By late evening, the wind had picked up, setting the door to shuddering in its frame. After supper, Heath unrolled a map across the table. "There's a man east of Missoula selling a few head of Hereford. Might be time we thought about cattle." Priscilla rested her chin in her hand. "We'd need fencing. And winter feed. I've got enough split rails for the north end. We could run a line between the willows and the creek." She traced a road on the map with her fingertip. "You'd be gone 3 days, maybe 4 if the weather turns." He looked at her then, not at the map. "Would you be all right here?" "I can manage the stove and the animals," she said. "But I'd rather you didn't go alone." His eyes softened just a little. "I could ask Seth Dunley to ride out with me. He's decent with cattle." She nodded. "You trust him?" "With livestock, yes. With anything else, I'd sooner hire a mule." That made her laugh, and the sound lingered between them longer than usual. The next morning, Heath left early, saddle creaking beneath him, rifle slung across his back. Priscilla watched him disappear down the trail, arms wrapped around herself. Once the pine trees swallowed his shape, she turned back inside and began setting aside the root vegetables, placing them carefully in the cellar, checking each one for softness or mold. Late afternoon brought a knock. She opened the door with flour on her hands and the fire low behind her. A woman stood there, wrapped in a faded shawl, cheeks red from the cold. "Name's Ruthie Talmadge," she said, eyes sharp beneath a drooping bonnet. "I was passing south when my horse went lame. Saw the smoke and thought to ask for help." Priscilla stepped aside. "Come in. Warm yourself." Inside, Ruthie sat near the hearth, boots steaming. She eyed the cabin with the quickness of someone used to measuring people by their walls. "This your place?" "It belongs to my husband," Priscilla said, setting tea to boil. "Thought I heard he lived out here alone." "He did," she replied, voice even. "Then I showed up." Ruthie tilted her head. "You a mail-order bride?" "No, widow." "Yes." Ruthie didn't press further. "I'll sleep in the barn if you've no room. There's space by the stove. You'll catch your death out there." That night, Ruthie slept on a spread of quilts, and Priscilla kept a small knife beneath her pillow, just in case. The next day passed without event. Ruthie left by midday, leading her limping horse. Priscilla stood at the edge of the trail until the woman vanished down the ridge. Something about her left a knot in the air, but nothing had been taken, and the hens were still in their coop. Heath returned 2 days later, just after dusk. His boots were crusted with mud and his eyes tired, but he smiled when he saw her on the porch. 5 heifers and a bull," he said, patting his saddlebag. "And a sack of oats as part of the deal." She took the reins and led the horse toward the barn. "You look half dead." "I'd settle for half warm." When they stepped inside, the scent of stew pulled a groan from him. Priscilla handed him a tin plate. "Someone came by," she said once they'd Saturday, "a woman. Ruthie Talmadge." He'd set down his spoon. "Did she ask questions?" "Some." She met his eyes. "Nothing I answered wrong." He nodded. "I've heard her name. Used to run whiskey east of Lolo. Drifted through Dry Creek after the sheriff sent her packing. She didn't take anything. But I didn't sleep." He reached across the table and touched her wrist. "You're safe now." She didn't pull away. "I know." The fire cracked between them. Outside, the wind picked up again, but inside, the warmth held. That night, when they lay down, he rested his hand over hers in the dark. "Did you miss me?" he asked, voice low. "I counted every mile." He leaned close, breath steady. "I don't want to leave again unless you come with me." Priscilla turned to face him. "Then don't." Their hands found each other without searching, and the long quiet hours of the night passed with breath and warmth shared between them. Snow whispered against the windows, but inside they held the season at bay. By late October, the hills stood brittle and gold, and a hush had settled across the land like it was holding its breath. Smoke curled from the chimney each morning, and inside the cabin, the rhythm of Heath and Priscilla's life moved with quiet certainty. He rose before the frost melted, splitting logs and checking the livestock. She kept the hearth and larder, drying herbs by the window and stitching new linings into their winter coats. The cattle had taken to their new pasture, slow and deliberate creatures that watched Priscilla with dark, curious eyes whenever she passed. Heath built a lean-to near the barn for feed and tools, and each evening he came in with sawdust in his hair and a look that steadied her more than any warm fire ever could. One morning, as Priscilla scraped the last of the cornmeal into a tin, Heath set a wrapped bundle on the table. "Found this in Missoula," he said. "Merchant was clearing out stock before the rail line cuts through." She unwrapped it slowly. Inside lay a bolt of deep indigo calico, the weave tight and smooth beneath her fingertips. "For you," he said. She traced the edge of the fabric in silence. "You didn't have to." "I know," he said, "but I wanted to see you wear something that wasn't mended 10 times over." She folded the cloth careful. "I'll make a dress. Something proper." He watched her a moment, then nodded and stepped outside. That afternoon, while he worked the fence line, she cleared the table and laid out the calico, pinning muslin to pattern and cutting with measured hands. The needle moved steady between her fingers, and with each stitch she felt something settle in her. Not the ache of grief or the tremble of uncertainty, but something rooted and strong. Just before sundown, a rider came up the trail. Heath met him by the barn. The 2 men spoke in low tones, and Priscilla, standing by the porch, caught only fragments: trouble near Hamilton, broken gate, 2 missing calves. Heath nodded once, then turned toward her. "Neighbors heard wandered off." He asked if I'd ride out, help him track them before snow hits. She stepped down off the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. How long? 2 nights, maybe 3. Depends how far they've gone. She studied his face, the way his brows stayed flat even when his voice dipped. Take the rifle with the clean sight. He reached for her waist, drawing her to him. I'll be back before you miss me. She rested her forehead against his collarbone. That's not possible. He kissed the side of her head and left before full dark. The cabin felt hollow without him. Priscilla moved through it with quiet purpose, finishing the dress, sealing jars of dried apples, and sweeping the corners where wind crept in. At night, she sat by the fire with her mending, the needle slipping through linen in rhythm with the ticking clock. On the second evening, a soft knock came at the door. She opened it to find a boy no older than 12, cheeks raw from wind, jacket too thin for the cold. He held a sack in one hand and looked up with cautious eyes. My pa sent me to ask if you had any ginger root, he said. Ma's got a fever. Priscilla ushered him in before he finished. Sit. Get warm. I'll pack what I have. She wrapped the root in muslin, added willow bark and instructions, then ladled hot stew into a tin and pressed it into his hands. You ride safe, and tell your father I'll come by if she worsens. He nodded, eyes lowered. Thank you, ma'am. After he left, she watched his small figure vanish into the dusk, heart heavy with memory. By the time Heath returned, the stove was burning low and a pot of beans simmered. He stepped through the door, boots thick with mud, and hung his coat before pulling her into his arms. Missed you, he murmured into her temple. She leaned against him. You're late. Snow farther up slowed us, but we found them. Fence was down near the gulch. He pulled back and caught sight of the dress hanging by the hearth. Is that it? She nodded. Tried it on yesterday. Fits well. He stepped over and ran a hand along the sleeve. You'll wear it tomorrow? If you build the bench you keep talking about for the porch. He chuckled low. Deal. The next morning, beneath the pale sun and the last of the turning leaves, she stepped out wearing the indigo dress. Heath straightened from his work, eyes pausing on her like he'd forgotten how to speak. You look like spring in the middle of frost, he said. She came down the steps quiet. I feel like I belong here now. He reached for her hand. You always did. Just took time for you to see it. They stood there in the stillness, fingers laced as the wind moved through the fields. Behind them, the cabin stood solid, the smoke thin and steady from its chimney. Neither of them spoke again that morning. They didn't need to. The first heavy snow came in early November, blanketing the hills in silence. Heath had just finished stacking the last of the split wood under the eaves, and Priscilla stood at the window, watching the flakes drift past the corners of the glass like they had no end to reach. She moved slower those days, her body leaning into the season the way some trees bowed under snow. He noticed the way she paused on the stairs to the loft, how she rubbed her lower back after long hours at the table. But she didn't complain and he didn't press. Instead, he kept the fire hot and made sure the path to the barn stayed clear. One afternoon, she set a pot of snow to melt on the stove and turned toward him, her fingers trailing the edge of the table. There's a family east of town, she said. The Finleys. I heard from Ruthie they lost their roof in the last windstorm. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. You want to help them. They've got 4 children. The youngest isn't walking yet. He nodded once, already reaching for his coat. I can take a load of shingles and some canvas. Maybe rope if the rafters are bad. I stitched a heavy quilt last week, she said. They'll need it more than we will. He met her eyes, something quiet passing between them. You always think about the ones out in the cold. She gave a small shrug. Someone ought to. He left at first light the next day, bundled provisions tied behind his saddle. The wind was bitter, and by the time he reached the Finley place, the drifts had deepened along the tree line. He didn't return for 2 nights, and when he did, he carried a weariness that sat deep in his shoulders. They'd been using feed sacks to keep out the wind, he said, easing off his boots. Little girl had frostbite in 2 fingers. I set the rafters best I could, but that whole place won't hold past January. She took his coat and hung it near the fire. "We'll find a way to bring them here, just until spring." He looked down at her, the firelight catching in his beard. "You'd open our door to 7 more mouths without blinking." She didn't flinch. "There's room. We'll make it stretch." He reached for her hand, his fingers rough against her palm. "I married a woman braver than any man I've known." She leaned into him, letting that truth settle between them. The days shortened. Snow deepened. Heath spent more time indoors, carving narrow drawer boxes for the pantry shelves and whittling a cradle from pine he'd been saving since summer. He didn't say anything when he started it, just laid out the boards and worked with quiet purpose. One evening, she found him smoothing the final corner. "You think she'll like it?" he asked without looking up. Priscilla touched the edge, the shape of it already familiar. He nodded once. "Feels like a girl." Her hand drifted to her stomach, the swell of it no longer hidden. "I haven't told you how I know." He sat back on his heels, wiping dust from his hands. "You didn't need to." She knelt beside him, resting her head against his shoulder. "I was afraid at first." "I know. But now," she said, voice low, "it feels like something whole started growing where all the hollow used to be." He wrapped his arm around her, his touch careful. "She's coming into a world that already loves her." That night, they sat near the hearth with her feet in his lap and the fire dancing against the walls. He read aloud from a worn book he'd kept tucked away in a chest, the words slow and deliberate as though they were meant to be spoken only when the world was still. Winter pressed down harder after that. The Finleys arrived 2 weeks before Christmas, bundled in coats too thin for the cold. Priscilla opened the cabin door wide and set the children near the hearth with bowls of stew while Heath showed Mr. Finley to the barn loft. No one asked for more than was offered. They shared in what they had, and the cabin held firm. On Christmas morning, Priscilla woke to the sound of Heath splitting kindling outside. She rose slowly, the weight of the child shifting under her ribs, and stepped into the kitchen to find a folded scrap of paper on the table. Her name scrawled in his hand. She opened it. "I built this home with my hands, but it didn't become a life until you stepped inside it." She pressed the note to her chest. Later, when the Finley children were chasing each other through the snow and the stew bubbled on the stove, she found him in the barn, brushing down the mare. "There's no gift I can give you to match what you've given me," she said. He turned, brushing hay from his sleeve. "You gave me something I didn't think I'd ever have again. A reason to look forward." "I want to marry you again," she said, her voice trembling. "You already did." "Once when I was drowning," she said. "Now, because I'm not." He stepped to her, the cold forgotten. "Then let's say the words again." They stood there, between hay bales and weathered beams, and promised each other the same things they already lived every day. Outside, the snow softened everything. Inside, they became a family. The first thaw came slow that spring, peeling back the snow in patches like old wallpaper. Mud clung to boots, and the fields softened underfoot. Priscilla stood with her hands braced against her lower back, watching the creek push through the last of the ice. Heath stood nearby, hammering the final plank onto the porch bench he'd promised months back. "You're sure she'll wait until April?" he asked without looking up. "She'll come when she's ready," Priscilla said, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. "But the way she's pushing, I doubt she'll wait more than another week." He dropped the hammer into the toolbox, wiped his hands on his trousers, and came to her side. "I wouldn't mind if she had your timing. Steady. Certain." She leaned into his warmth. "You think I'm steady? You hold a house of 9 together with a look and a kettle," he said. "That's more than steady." The Finleys had moved into the shelter Heath built near the barn, a tight but dry space that belonged to them now. Mr. Finley worked the fence lines with Heath most mornings, and the eldest son, barely into his teens, had taken to sweeping the porch without being asked. There was no need to speak of gratitude when it showed itself in small, steady acts. Priscilla walked slower now. The child moved often, sometimes with a sharpness that took her breath. Ruthie had returned before the last frost, traveling north with a man who never spoke. She stayed 2 nights, then left behind a pouch of dried sage and a note folded into a scrap of cotton. Priscilla tucked it away without reading it aloud. One afternoon, as Heath returned from town with a sack of flour and a new set of hinges, he found her on the floor, one hand gripping the table leg, the other pressed hard against her belly. He dropped everything and knelt beside her. "Tell me what's happening." Her voice came tight. "She's coming." He lifted her gently, carried her to the bed, and stoked the fire until the heat pushed into every corner of the cabin. A neighbor's wife, Mrs. Tiller, arrived before sunset, her hands steady, her voice low. Priscilla said little, just met Heath's eyes between each wave of pain, and he stayed beside her, letting her grip his hand until dawn. The child came into the world just after the first light touched the ridge, a small, red-faced girl with a full head of black hair and a cry that filled the room. Mrs. Tiller wrapped her in a length of wool and laid her in Priscilla's arms. Heath sat on the edge of the bed, knees wide, watching them both with a look that held no fear, only wonder. "She's perfect," he said. Priscilla looked down at the child and then up at him. "She has your mouth." He laughed, soft and surprised. "Poor girl." "Strong mouth," Priscilla said. "Kind eyes." They named her Willa. Life settled again, shaped now around new rhythms. Priscilla nursed by the fire while Heath chopped kindling. Willa grew quickly, her fists always curled, her eyes following the light where it moved across the floor. Heath built a cradle that rocked with the gentlest nudge, and Priscilla hung a strip of ribbon above it that danced whenever the door opened. One morning, as the grass began to green along the creek and the first crocuses pushed through the damp earth, Heath came in from the barn with a folded paper in his hand. "Rails reached Missoula," he said. "They're hiring folks to build east. Could mean more folks settling near us come summer." She looked up from her sewing. "You worried?" He shook his head, setting the paper down. "No. Just figuring how we'll stretch the pasture. Might need another shelter if we take on more neighbors come fall." She set her needle aside. "You'd make room for more." "I would," he said. "But I'd ask you first." "You don't need to ask." He crossed the room to her, lifted Willa from the cradle, and settled her in the crook of his arm. "You gave me this life." "I didn't give it," she said. "We built it." They spent that evening on the porch, Willa asleep in Priscilla's arms, the three Finley children chasing fireflies across the yard. Mr. Finley whittled quietly near the stump, and his wife stirred the stew pot hung over the fire pit. The hills glowed copper in the setting sun, and the air held the scent of thawed earth and wood smoke. Heath reached for Priscilla's hand. "I used to think quiet meant loneliness." She laced her fingers through his. "And now it sounds like peace." She rested her head on his shoulder, her body warm against his, their daughter curled between them. "Then we've done it right." He kissed the top of her head, slow and certain. "We have." Years later, neighbors would say that the Rowans were the kind of folks who never raised their voices but always got heard. That their door was never locked and their table never empty. That Willa grew up with dirt on her knees and stories in her ears, a girl who knew how to ride bareback and boil coffee both. But none of that was spoken now. Now, the sun sank low and the porch creaked beneath their feet, and the two of them sat wrapped in the kind of quiet that had nothing to do with silence and everything to do with love earned slow and deep and for life.